Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I listened with great interest to the contribution by Senator McAllister, my valued colleague on the Finance and Public Administration Committee, and it was a thoughtful and measured contribution, as her contributions typically are. But I was listening very carefully for one particular fact or contribution in her speech which didn't come, and it's an important one in the debate about inequality. And that is particularly a burden that I think advocates of action on inequality must meet, is how much inequality is too much inequality and how much inequality is an acceptable level of inequality. That might sound like a strange thing to say. One might assume, if one agrees that inequality is a terrible thing, which most people do, that there should be no inequality. But if there were no inequality, then that would mean complete equality of outcomes. And I don't think anyone in this chamber advocates that. I don't think Senator McAllister advocates that. I don't think Senator Whish-Wilson, who I understand is speaking next, advocates that, although perhaps his colleague Senator Rhiannon would advocate that. I don't know how much her thinking has evolved on these issues. It's an important question to answer, because if we agree that complete equality is not a good idea, and if we agree that complete inequality is not a good idea, where do we draw the line between complete equality and complete inequality as to an acceptable level of inequality? I've not yet heard, certainly not in this debate, but in dozens of debates on this issue by economists and academics and others who take an interest in it, anyone nominate an acceptable level of inequality or a tolerable level of inequality. And I think that's an important thing to nominate, because if we are seeking to address a problem, we have to know how to define it in an empirical way, know when we're making progress on it, know when we're falling back on it. And I look forward perhaps to later contributions in this debate and whether anyone will rise to that challenge. Inequality is a problem, and it is something which government has a role to tackle in some ways, but it is a much less serious problem than poverty. Poverty is something which demands much greater attention from all of us than inequality, and I make that point very deliberately, and I'll expand on it. A lot of the measures of inequality and poverty sometimes are deliberately or perhaps accidentally confused. Senator McAllister, in her contribution, referred to a number of facts and figures about how the top 10 people in Australia have more wealth than the bottom 50%, and all these sorts of figures which get thrown around in this debate. They're thrown around in Australia and also internationally. They typically come from reports which are deeply flawed and which overlook the much more important human imperative, which is to abolish poverty and to lift people out of poverty. And sometimes lifting people out of poverty and reducing inequality are in fact competing imperatives and contrasting imperatives which don't always move in the same direction at the same time. And there's a specific example I'll come to later. One of the reports which purports to be about poverty is an annual report produced by ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Service in Australia. It purports to measure poverty in Australia, but what it in fact measures is inequality. It defines poverty as anyone being below 50% of the average wage. Now, obviously, if you define poverty as a proportion of the average wage, then it doesn't matter how much the average wage increases, you will never eradicate poverty. That's a disturbing thing, because we know that poverty has been largely or substantially eradicated in the wealthy Western world, and we're making great gains to eradicating it around the world, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century. Another report which is often relied upon by advocates in this space is one by Oxfam International, which annually publishes a report on inequality, and it sometimes has seemingly alarmingly sounding statistics about the top 5 wealthiest people in the world and their share of global wealth compared to the bottom half of the population. But it has some fundamental flaws. One of the flaws is that it accepts as a premise that capturing someone's wealth in a single point in time is a good proxy or a good measure for their standard of living. And we know, in fact, that that is not the case. It's often a very bad measure of their standard of living. And within the Oxfam report, we have a very good example of why that's the case. When measuring someone's wealth for the purposes of comparing them for inequality, they of course take into account, as may be appropriate, any debts that a person may hold. And obviously a person who has debts, particularly a young person who has debts, perhaps a university student, has the potential to have negative wealth. So a young Australian university student, or indeed a university student at Harvard, will be measured by Oxfam as having negative wealth. Now, in many parts of the world, you cannot get a loan. In the developing world, it's very difficult sometimes to get a loan. And so a subsistence farmer in Africa may not have any debts, may even have a few assets to their name, and maybe, for the purposes of Oxfam's inequality report, be listed as having small net positive assets, even only in the few $100s. Now, if you listen to Oxfam, if you take them at their word, a privileged student in the Western world studying at university who has a HECS debt, for example, is poorer than a subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, that highlights, I think, very powerfully the lack of quality research in this area and the way in which statistics can be abused to give you a very misleading impression. If you took Oxfam at their word, you would believe that a substantial number of those people suffering severe inequality are in fact in the Western world, when clearly the reverse is the case. By any standard, we are the wealthiest people in the world. If we really care about poverty, and poverty is what we seek to alleviate, then growth is the best way to do that. Economic growth is the best way to do that. And sometimes economic growth does come at a cost to inequality. The best example of this is the economic growth that China has experienced over the last 40 years. It has been, in my view, one of the most positive developments of the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century. Over 600 million people have been lifted above the poverty line, the absolute measure of poverty. Their lives have been transformed in a fundamental and wonderful way. People who didn't have access to electricity now have access to electricity. People who didn't have access to refrigeration now have access to refrigeration. People who didn't have access to education now have access to education. The standard of their food and clothing and technology has improved in a profound way. And while this magnificent reduction in poverty has taken place within China in the span of 40 years, one of the greatest reductions in human poverty in history, inequality has increased. Now, if you listen to those opposite and their concerns about inequality, and if you read Thomas Piketty, then you would think that inequality must be fought at all costs. And I understand where they're coming from, and it's a good place to come from. Equality on its own, as a premise, sounds like a bad thing. But what do you think the people in China who've been lifted out of poverty would have rathered? Would they have rather be lifted out of poverty as they have? And also, at the same time, some people in China accumulate great wealth, billions of dollars of wealth, or would they have rathered to stay, as they were, for most of their history in real poverty? I think if I was someone living in China and I had to choose to remain in my station of life and in relative poverty, in order to keep others in poverty at the same time so that we could be relatively equal, or if I could choose that my wealth would increase modestly and my living standards would increase modestly and some other standards of living would increase spectacularly and far more than mine, I would accept that. I would accept an increase in inequality for me and for my society in order to have a decrease in poverty. Poverty is a far more important thing to fight than inequality. I think we had a really wonderful contribution to this debate in a general way in the maiden speech last night of Senator Geshohei from South Australia. She spoke very powerfully of her own journey from Kenya to Australia and for her experience of the welfare state in Australia and the effect it had on her and her family, and the observations she made, I think, were very powerful. I think we should always bear in mind, as Senator Geshohei said, that the best path out of poverty is employment and jobs, and that has always been and will always be a priority of my side of politics and of this government. Finally, I want to turn to the Productivity Commission Amendment Bill itself, proposed by Senator McAllister. And while I, like her, respect the Productivity Commission as an important institution, and I, like her, respect its work, it's for that reason that I'm concerned about this proposal, this specific proposal. I think it seeks to politicise the Productivity Commission in an inappropriate way. As Senator McAllister admitted, she's a person of the left, and she wants to see the Productivity Commission produce reports that align with her political priorities, that address issues of her political priorities. I don't think that's an appropriate thing to do with an independent economic agency like the Productivity Commission, which has provided such important reports and advice to government. I think it's best that, as far as possible, it be kept at arm's length from government and it not be dictated to by the politics of the day, so that it has the greatest potential to provide independent, dispassionate advice to the government. I think it is unwise to try to seek to direct the Productivity Commission to address the political priorities of any party in this place or any philosophy. There are certainly changes we could make to the Productivity Commission's charter to address priorities that I might have and concerns that I might have, and ensure that the Productivity Commission's reports in the future more closely match the political priorities I have. But I recognise that I'm a member of a political party, that I have my own views, that I have my own preconceptions, and it wouldn't be a good idea to ask the Productivity Commission to take those on and reflect those. So I appreciate the concern of Senator McAllister and all senators in this place about inequality. I would finish on the note that while inequality can be and is important, poverty is far more important. If we ever have to choose between the two, as some people have, including in China, the best one to choose is to alleviate poverty. And the best way to alleviate poverty is through free markets and economic freedom. Every country that has gone from relative poverty to relative prosperity has gone through a period of inequality as a result. And actually, it's the advanced capitalist countries of the world, like Australia, which are relatively equal by world standards, and it is through a state of far-reaching and complete capitalism that inequality is best tackled rather than government intervention.
Thank you, Senator Paterson.